The sun was setting on what felt like the longest Saturday shift ever at the local KFC. The young employee behind the drive-through window had been there since the morning rush, dealing with one challenging situation after another. His uniform was already showing signs of the day's chaos, a small ketchup stain on his sleeve and his name tag slightly crooked from constantly adjusting his headset. The restaurant's parking lot was packed, with cars lined up around the building. Inside, the kitchen buzzed with the sound of fryers and the familiar aroma of the Colonel's secret recipe filled the air. But something was different about today. Maybe it was the broken ice cream machine that had customers complaining since lunch, or perhaps it was the fact that they were short-staffed again, with 2 workers calling in sick at the last minute. "Order when you're ready," the drive-through worker said into his headset for what felt like the 100th time that hour. His voice was getting hoarse from repeating the same phrases over and over. The evening rush was in full swing, and the line of cars seemed endless. Every few minutes, the kitchen printer would spit out another ticket, adding to the growing stack of orders. The worker had started this job 6 months ago with high hopes. It was supposed to be temporary, just something to help pay the bills while he figured out his next move. But here he was, half a year later, still standing in the same spot, watching life pass by through a small window. His feet ached from the long hours of standing, and the constant beeping of the drive-through sensor was starting to feel like it was permanently embedded in his brain. "Welcome to KFC," he said automatically as another car pulled up to the speaker. The customer ordered a family meal, a pretty standard request for a Saturday evening. Everything seemed normal until the order reached the window. That's when things started to go sideways. The customer, a middle-aged man wearing a polo shirt, had his family in the car. He was polite at first, but his expression changed as he checked the contents of his order. "Hey, there's something missing here," he said, rifling through the bags. "We're supposed to have 8 biscuits with this meal, but I only count 7. On any other day, this would have been a simple fix. Apologize, grab an extra biscuit, problem solved. But today was different. Maybe it was the exhaustion from working doubles all week. Maybe it was the steady stream of complaints about things beyond his control. Or maybe it was just the final straw in a long string of frustrations." The worker looked at the time, 7:45 p.m. His shift was supposed to end at 8 o'clock, but he knew that wouldn't happen with this lineup. His supervisor had disappeared on a quick break 30 minutes ago, leaving him to handle the growing line of customers alone. The kitchen staff was backed up with orders, and the front counter was equally swamped. "Sir, I can check the order ticket," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. But the customer was already shaking his head, holding up the receipt like evidence in a court case. "It says right here, 8 biscuits. This is the 3rd time this week I've had problems with my order at this location." The worker felt something shift inside him. It wasn't just about the missing biscuit anymore. It was about every customer who yelled at him over cold fries. Every shift he'd worked alone when others didn't show up. Every time he'd apologized for things that weren't his fault. His hands started trembling slightly as he gripped the counter. The line of cars behind this customer kept growing, their headlights creating long shadows through the drive-through window. The kitchen printer kept chirping with new orders, and somewhere in the background, he could hear other customers complaining about the wait time. The customer was still talking, his voice getting louder with each word. "I want to speak to your manager right now," he demanded, his family watching uncomfortably from the car. The worker looked around the kitchen, still no sign of his supervisor. The pressure was building, like a pot about to boil over. In that moment, something inside him snapped. 6 months of pent-up frustration, countless hours of staying late, dealing with endless complaints, it all came rushing to the surface. He yanked off his headset, the plastic making a cracking sound as it hit the counter. The security camera in the corner silently recorded as he pushed open the back door, stepping out into the warm evening air. His heart was pounding in his chest, and his thoughts were clouded by a red haze of anger. As he walked toward the customer's car, he could hear his co-workers calling after him, their voices filled with concern and confusion. Little did anyone know that what was about to happen next would change multiple lives forever, becoming one of those viral moments that people would talk about for months to come. But right then, in that crucial moment, all rational thought had left the building, replaced by pure, unfiltered emotion. The warm evening air hit the worker's face as he pushed through the back door of the restaurant. The sounds of the kitchen faded behind him, replaced by the idle rumble of car engines and the distant noise of traffic from the main road. His steps across the pavement were quick and determined, each one fueled by months of bottled-up frustration. Inside the customer's car, the atmosphere shifted. The two kids in the back seat stopped playing with their toys, sensing the change in their parents' body language. The wife quickly pulled out her phone, her instincts telling her to document whatever was about to unfold. The husband, still holding the receipt in his hand, watched through his side mirror as the worker approached. Other customers in the drive-through line began to notice something was wrong. A teenager in a red sedan 3 cars back started recording with his phone. An elderly couple in the car directly behind the dispute turned off their engine, unsure whether to leave the line or stay put. The drive-through speaker continued to crackle with new customers trying to place orders, but nobody was there to respond. Inside the restaurant, everything was chaos. The kitchen staff paused mid-task, watching through the drive-through window. A young cashier at the front counter quickly dialed the supervisor's number again, getting voicemail for the 3rd time. The assistant manager, who was supposed to be on break, was stuck in traffic 20 minutes away, desperately trying to get back after receiving multiple panic texts from the team. "Is there a problem here?" the worker called out as he approached the car, his voice carrying across the parking lot. His name tag glinted under the bright outdoor lights, and his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. The customers waiting inside the restaurant pressed against the windows, their own meals temporarily forgotten as they watched the scene unfold. The customer, caught off guard by this sudden confrontation, stepped out of his car. He was taller than the worker had expected, and his calm demeanor made the worker's aggressive approach seem even more out of place. "Look," the customer said, keeping his voice level, "I just want to talk to a manager about my order. That's all." But the worker wasn't listening anymore. 6 months of late nights, missed breaks, and demanding customers played through his mind like a movie on fast forward. The missing biscuit wasn't just a missing biscuit, it was every time he'd been yelled at, every shift he'd covered, every moment he'd felt powerless in this job. "You want to talk?" the worker shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. "That's all anyone ever wants to do. Talk. Complain. About biscuits, about wait times, about everything." His uniform shirt was untucked now, the small ketchup stain from earlier seeming to spread in the heat of the moment. The other employees had gathered at the back door, unsure whether to intervene. The drive-through line had grown to wrap completely around the building, with some customers pulling out their phones to record while others humped their horns in frustration. The scene was becoming a perfect storm of modern viral video material. The customer raised his hands in a peaceful gesture, taking a small step back. "Hey, buddy, I can see you're having a rough day. Why don't we both take a breath?" His wife was still recording from the passenger seat, her free hand gripping the door handle, ready to step out if needed. Their kids had sunk lower in their seats, their earlier excitement about getting KFC completely forgotten. But the worker took this calm response as condescension. "Don't buddy me," he snapped, stepping closer. His whole body was trembling now, adrenaline coursing through his system. The restaurant's outdoor speakers were still automatically playing upbeat music, creating an eerily inappropriate soundtrack to the unfolding drama. A crowd had started to gather in the parking lot. Some were filming, others were calling out warnings to both men to calm down. A young woman in scrubs, probably from the urgent care center next door, was already on the phone with the police. The sun had almost completely set now, and the restaurant's bright outdoor lights cast harsh shadows across the scene. The worker's next words came out in a rush. "You think you can just come here, make demands, treat us like we're nothing? Like we're just machines here to serve you?" His voice was rising with each word, emotions he'd suppressed for months finally breaking free. The customer maintained his defensive stance, eyes darting between the worker and his family in the car. Nobody in the growing crowd could have predicted what would happen next. The worker, pushed beyond his breaking point, was about to make a decision that would change not just his life, but the lives of everyone watching. The viral video that would emerge from the next few moments would spark discussions about customer service, working conditions, and human dignity that would reach far beyond this one KFC parking lot. The tension in the air was electric, like the moment before a storm breaks. Both men stood their ground, one fueled by months of pent-up frustration, the other trying to maintain calm in an increasingly volatile situation. The next few seconds would determine whether this confrontation would end in violence or if someone would finally step in to prevent what was about to happen. Time seemed to slow down in the KFC parking lot as the situation reached its boiling point. The customer, who nobody knew was actually a former amateur boxer, maintained his defensive stance. His past experience in the ring had taught him to read body language, and right now, every muscle in the worker's body was screaming confrontation. From the passenger seat, the customer's wife continued recording while trying to calm their children. "Everything's okay," she whispered to them, though her shaking phone betrayed her nervousness. The kids, usually energetic and playful, sat in complete silence, their half-eaten chicken forgotten in their laps. The growing crowd of onlookers created a sort of makeshift arena in the parking lot. The phones recording the scene glowed like fireflies in the dimming evening light. Someone in the crowd shouted, "Come on, guys, it's just fast food." But their words were swallowed by the tension in the air. A teenage girl working the front counter finally got through to the supervisor on the phone. "You need to get back here now," she said urgently, watching through the window. "It's getting really bad." The sound of cars honking in the drive-through line provided a chaotic backdrop to her words. The customer took a deep breath, drawing on years of self-discipline from his boxing days. "Listen," he said calmly, his hands still raised in a non-threatening position. "I used to work in customer service too. I know it's tough. Why don't we take this inside and talk it out?" His voice was steady, but his eyes never left the worker's clenched fists. The worker's response was like a pot finally boiling over. "Talk it out," he said, his voice rising. "That's what everyone says. Talk it out. Let's discuss it. Meanwhile, we're understaffed, overworked, and treated like we're nothing." His uniform shirt was now completely untucked, his name tag hanging by a single pin. More cars had stopped on the main road, drivers slowing down to watch the scene unfolding in the parking lot. The restaurant's outdoor speakers continued their cheerful music playlist, now playing an upbeat pop song that felt bizarrely out of place. The smell of fried chicken and tension filled the air. The customer's wife had unbuckled her seatbelt now, ready to step out if needed. She knew her husband's history, how he'd walked away from boxing to focus on their family, how he promised never to fight again. But she also saw the familiar look in his eyes, the one that said he was calculating distances and angles, just like in his boxing days. Inside the restaurant, the kitchen staff had abandoned their posts to watch through the windows. Orders piled up, timers beeped unattended, and fresh batches of chicken stayed in the fryers a bit too long. The young cashier was now on the phone with the police, trying to explain the situation without making it sound worse than it was. The worker took another step forward, entering what any trained fighter would recognize as striking distance. His whole body trembled with 6 months of suppressed emotions. "You think you understand?" he challenged. "You have no idea what it's like here, every single day, dealing with people who think they're better than us." A woman in the crowd, wearing nursing scrubs, tried to step forward to intervene. "Hey, both of you need to take a step back," she called out. But her professional de-escalation training couldn't penetrate the bubble of tension that had formed around the two men. The customer's mind raced through his options. His boxing instincts were screaming at him to maintain proper distance, to protect himself, but his promise to his family held him back. He could see his children's faces reflected in the car window behind him, their eyes wide with concern. The worker's next move changed everything. In his emotional state, he reached out and shoved the customer's shoulder. It wasn't a punch, but it was enough to cross the line from verbal to physical confrontation. The crowd collectively gasped, phones raised higher to capture whatever would happen next. Time seemed to freeze in that moment. The customer's body automatically shifted into a familiar stance, muscle memory from years of training taking over. The worker, realizing he'd crossed a line, but too far gone to back down, raised his fists in what looked like a poor imitation of a fighting pose. The police sirens could be heard in the distance now, their wailing growing louder with each passing second. The restaurant's security cameras continued their silent recording, capturing every moment of what was about to become one of the most viewed fast food confrontations on social media. In the final seconds before everything exploded, the customer made one last attempt at peace. "You don't want to do this," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who knew exactly how these situations could end. "Think about what happens next. Think about your job, your future." But the worker was beyond thinking about consequences. 6 months of frustration had built up to this moment, and there was no going back. The next few seconds would transform this ordinary KFC parking lot into the stage for a viral video that would have people talking for months to come. Everything happened in a flash. The worker, running purely on emotion, threw a wild punch that whistled through the air. The customer, drawing on years of boxing experience, leaned back just enough for the punch to graze his chin. The crowd's collective gasp provided the soundtrack to this moment, along with the clicks of dozens of phone cameras. Time seemed to move in slow motion. The restaurant's bright overhead lights cast strange shadows across the scene, making everything feel almost dreamlike. The drive-through speaker crackled with the voice of a new customer, oblivious to the drama unfolding just around the corner. "Hello, is anyone there?" The worker's punch had thrown him off balance, his fast food training obviously not including proper fighting stance. His name tag finally gave up its fight to stay attached and clattered to the pavement, spinning like a fallen coin. The sound seemed to echo across the now silent parking lot. Inside the car, the customer's wife had stopped recording and was now on the phone with emergency services. "Please hurry," she whispered, her voice trembling as she described the scene. Their kids had covered their eyes, but were peeking through their fingers, unable to completely look away from what was happening. The crowd had grown larger, with some people shouting for them to stop, while others continued recording. A group of teenagers from the neighboring burger place had wandered over, their own shifts forgotten as they watched the scene unfold. One of them was already live streaming on social media, providing running commentary in hushed tones. The worker, emboldened by landing even a glancing blow, pressed forward with another wild swing. His uniform shirt had come completely untucked, the small ketchup stain from earlier now joined by sweat marks. His eyes held a mix of anger and something else, perhaps the first glimmer of reality breaking through his emotional haze. The customer continued to dodge, his movements efficient and practiced. Anyone with boxing experience would have recognized his footwork, the subtle shifts and weight transfers that spoke of years in the ring. But his face showed no anger, only concentration and perhaps a hint of sadness. He kept his hands raised defensively, still trying to avoid turning this into a real fight. From inside the restaurant, the remaining staff watched in horror. The young cashier had abandoned the register entirely, her hands pressed against the window. The kitchen timers continued their insistent beeping, mixing with the distant sound of approaching sirens. The scent of burning chicken floated through the air. Nobody had remembered to check the fryers. Another customer in the drive-through line honked their horn, the sound making everyone jump. The worker used this moment to launch another attack, this time throwing a series of uncoordinated punches. His fast food visor flew off his head, landing in a puddle of spilled soda nearby. His breathing was heavy, months of standing behind a counter doing little to prepare him for this kind of exertion. The customer continued his defensive movements, each dodge making the worker more frustrated. "Stand still," the worker shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. The customer replied calmly, between movements, "You don't want to do this. It's not too late to stop." A car at the back of the drive-through line tried to back out, causing a minor collision with another vehicle. The sound of crunching metal added to the chaos. The nurse in scrubs was now on her phone too, presumably calling for backup from the urgent care center next door. The whole scene had taken on a surreal quality, like something out of a movie rather than a fast food parking lot. The worker's attacks were becoming more desperate and less coordinated. Sweat dripped down his face, his earlier rage now mixed with exhaustion. The customer continued his defensive stance, but anyone watching closely could see he was running out of options for peaceful resolution. The restaurant's outdoor speakers had switched to playing a slow love song, creating an almost comical contrast to the scene below. More cars had stopped on the main road, their headlights illuminating the impromptu arena that the parking lot had become. The number of recording phones had multiplied, their screens glowing like stars in the growing darkness. Finally, the worker made a crucial mistake. Frustrated by his inability to land a solid hit, he threw all his weight into one massive, telegraphed punch. As his fist cut through the air, Time seemed to slow down again. The customer's wife covered their children's eyes. The crowd held its collective breath. The police sirens were very close now, their lights starting to reflect off the restaurant's windows. The next second would change everything. The worker's wild swing had left him completely open, his balance compromised, his training non-existent. The customer, seeing no other choice, prepared to end this before someone got seriously hurt. His boxer's instincts took over, years of training crystallizing into one perfect moment of muscle memory and timing. What happened next would be replayed millions of times on social media, analyzed in countless comment sections, and discussed in break rooms across the country. The customer, drawing on years of boxing training, saw his opening. As the worker's wild punch threw him off balance, the customer executed a perfectly timed counter-punch, not with full force, but with just enough power to end the confrontation. The punch landed clean, almost gentle in its precision. It was the kind of hit that professional boxers spend years perfecting, the sort that looks almost effortless to observers, but carries the weight of countless hours of training. Time seemed to freeze as the worker's forward momentum stopped abruptly. The crowd went silent. The only sounds were the continuous beeping of the kitchen timers inside the restaurant and the approaching police sirens. The worker's eyes went wide with surprise, then slowly closed as his legs gave way beneath him. He fell backwards in what seemed like slow motion, like a tree finally surrendering to gravity. The customer's wife gasped from inside the car, her phone still recording everything. Their kids had uncovered their eyes just in time to see the end of the confrontation. The older child whispered, "Dad," in a confused voice, never having seen this side of their father before. Before the worker's head could hit the pavement, the customer moved with surprising speed. Years of ring experience had taught him not just how to fight, but how to protect a fallen opponent. He caught the worker's shoulders, guiding him down gently to the asphalt. The crowd murmured in surprise at this unexpected display of care. "Someone get a first aid kit," the customer called out, his voice steady but concerned. The nurse in scrubs who had been watching pushed through the crowd, already pulling on latex gloves from her pocket. The teenager who had been live streaming dropped his phone to his side, his commentary forgotten in the gravity of the moment. Inside the restaurant, the staff finally broke from their frozen state. The young cashier grabbed the first aid kit from behind the counter, while another worker finally remembered to check the burning chicken in the fryers. The assistant manager's car could be seen pulling into the parking lot, too late to prevent what had happened, but just in time for the aftermath. The customer knelt beside the unconscious worker, using his old boxing medical training to check vital signs. "He's breathing normally," he announced to the crowd, some of whom were still recording. He carefully turned the worker onto his side, placing him in the recovered position. The nurse nodded approvingly as she knelt down to help. The police sirens were very close now, their blue and red lights painting the scene in alternating colors. The crowd began to step back, creating space for the approaching authorities. Some people were already posting their videos online, but others had put their phones away, sobered by the reality of what they'd witnessed. The workers' fellow employees had come outside now, bringing wet towels and looking worried. One of them, an older lady who worked in the kitchen, was crying softly. "He's such a good kid," she kept saying. "He's never done anything like this before. He just needed a break." The customer's wife had stepped out of the car now, keeping their children inside but watching her husband with a mix of concern and pride. She knew he had done everything possible to avoid this outcome, and even now, he was making sure the worker was okay. This wasn't the violent ending many in the crowd had expected. Instead, it was almost peaceful in its way. The worker started to show signs of coming around, his eyelids flickering. The customer maintained his position, ready to keep him still if needed. "Take it easy," he said softly. "Don't try to get up just yet." The nurse checked the worker's pupils with a small flashlight from her keychain, noting that everything looked okay. As the first police car pulled into the parking lot, its lights illuminating the scene fully now, the reality of what had happened began to sink in for everyone watching. This wasn't just another viral fight video. It was a moment that captured something deeper about human nature, about conflict and compassion existing side by side. The customer looked up at his wife, their eyes meeting in a moment of understanding. This wasn't how either of them had planned to spend their Saturday evening, but sometimes life takes unexpected turns. In the distance, an ambulance siren could be heard approaching, its wail mixing with the still playing music from the restaurant's outdoor speakers. The worker's breathing remained steady, his face relaxed now in unconsciousness, all the anger and frustration that had built up over 6 months temporarily washed away. The customer kept his hand on the worker's shoulder, both to monitor his condition and to offer a human connection in this vulnerable moment. Sometimes, he knew from his boxing days, the person who loses a fight ends up winning something more important in the long run. The KFC parking lot had transformed into a scene of flashing lights and urgent activity. Police officers secured the area while paramedics made their way through the crowd with their medical equipment. The worker was still lying on his side in the recovered position, with the customer and the nurse from next door monitoring his condition carefully. "Can you hear me?" one of the paramedics asked, kneeling down beside the worker. The worker's eyes fluttered open, confusion evident on his face. The bright lights of the emergency vehicles created strange shadows across the parking lot, making everything seem surreal. The smell of burnt chicken still wafted from the restaurant's kitchen, a reminder of how quickly ordinary life had turned extraordinary. The customer stepped back to give the medical team space, but stayed close enough to keep watch. His wife approached him, putting a hand on his shoulder. "Are you okay?" she whispered. He nodded, but his eyes never left the worker. Their children watched from the car, pressing their faces against the window, trying to make sense of what they'd just witnessed. The police officers were gathering statements from the crowd, many of whom were eagerly sharing their video recordings of the incident. The teenager who had been live streaming was now surrounded by a small group, replaying the footage and providing commentary. "Look how he caught him before he hit the ground," someone said, pointing at the screen. "That's not what usually happens in these videos." Inside the restaurant, the assistant manager was finally dealing with the drive-through line, apologizing to customers and offering free meal vouchers. The kitchen staff had cleaned up the burnt chicken and were trying to get back to normal operations, but their eyes kept drifting to the scene outside. The young cashier was sitting on a milk crate in the back, still shaking from the whole experience. The worker was becoming more alert now, the paramedics helping him sit up slowly. "Take it easy," one of them advised as the worker touched the side of his face where the punch had landed. His eyes met the customer's, and for a moment, neither man spoke. The anger from earlier was gone, replaced by something more complex: embarrassment, realization, and perhaps a hint of gratitude for how things had turned out. "I need your statement, sir," a police officer said to the customer, notebook in hand. The customer's wife spoke up quickly. "We have everything on video." She pulled up the recording on her phone, showing how her husband had tried repeatedly to de-escalate the situation before being forced to defend himself. The officer watched the footage, nodding slowly. The workers' co-workers had gathered nearby, worry evident on their faces. The older kitchen lady who had been crying earlier stepped forward to speak with the police. "He's been working doubles all week," she explained, her voice trembling. "We're so short-staffed, and he never complains. This isn't like him at all." The paramedics helped the worker to his feet, supporting him as he swayed slightly. "We need to take you to the hospital for a checkup," they explained. "Standard procedure for any loss of consciousness." The worker nodded, looking down at his untucked uniform and the name tag lying forgotten on the ground. As they prepared to load him into the ambulance, the customer stepped forward. "Wait," he called out. Everyone turned to watch as he approached the worker. The crowd held their phones up again, expecting perhaps another confrontation, but what happened next would become the most shared part of all the videos. "I'm sorry it had to end this way," the customer said softly. "I know this job can be tough. I've been there." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. "When you're feeling better, give me a call. Maybe we can talk about finding you something different." The worker took the card with trembling fingers, looking confused but touched by the unexpected gesture. The paramedics helped the worker onto the stretcher, but before they could wheel him away, he spoke up. His voice was hoarse but clear. "I'm sorry about your biscuit." A small laugh rippled through the crowd, breaking the tension. The customer smiled and shook his head. "Don't worry about it. Just focus on getting better." As the ambulance doors closed and the sirens started up again, the customer's wife hugged him tightly. Their kids had finally emerged from the car, running to join the family embrace. The crowd began to disperse, but many stayed to watch the ambulance pull away, their phones still recording what had become much more than just another viral fight video. The police officers continued taking statements, but their tone had changed. This wasn't going to be treated as a typical assault case. The customer had clearly acted in self-defense and, more importantly, had shown remarkable restraint and compassion throughout the incident. Even now, he was talking with the assistant manager, offering to help cover the workers' medical expenses. As the night settled back into something resembling normalcy, the KFC's outdoor speakers continued their endless playlist, now playing a soft, hopeful tune. The drive-through line had finally cleared out, and the kitchen staff were cleaning up for the night. But everyone knew that this evening would be remembered for a long time to come, not just for the fight, but for what happened afterward. 3 weeks had passed since the incident at KFC, and the local diner was unusually quiet for a Tuesday morning. The worker sat in a corner booth, nervously adjusting his collar. He wasn't wearing a fast food uniform anymore. Instead, he had on a clean button-down shirt and khaki pants. The bruising on his face had completely faded, but the lessons from that night were still fresh in his mind. The bell above the diner's door chimed, and the customer walked in, dressed in his work clothes, a polo shirt with a local gym's logo on it. He spotted the worker and walked over, sliding into the opposite side of the booth. A waitress brought them coffee without asking, suggesting this wasn't their first meeting here. "How's the new job going?" the customer asked, stirring sugar into his coffee. The worker smiled. A genuine smile that reached his eyes, unlike the forced customer service ones he'd worn for so many months. "Really good," he replied. "I never thought I'd enjoy being a personal trainer's assistant, but your gym, it's different." The viral video of their fight had taken on a life of its own over the past 3 weeks. What started as just another viral fight clip had evolved into something more meaningful when people learned the full story. The customer, it turned out, owned a local gym and had been true to his word about helping the worker find a different path. "The anger management classes are helping too," the worker admitted, wrapping his hands around his coffee mug. "I never realized how much stuff I was bottling up inside." The customer nodded understandingly. He'd been there himself years ago, before boxing taught him discipline and self-control. Outside the diner's window, life went on as usual. Cars passed by, people walked their dogs, and somewhere in the distance, the familiar sign of KFC glowed in the morning sun. But inside, 2 men who should have been enemies were instead forming an unlikely friendship. "My wife's been asking when you're coming over for dinner again," the customer said, a hint of amusement in his voice. "The kids keep talking about how you taught them to do proper push-ups last time." The worker laughed, remembering how the children had insisted on showing him their toy collection after dinner, all traces of fear from that night long forgotten. The waitress brought them their usual breakfast order: eggs and toast for the customer, pancakes for the worker. As they ate, they talked about the future. The worker had started taking online business classes, inspired by the customer's success in running his own gym. "Maybe someday I'll open my own fitness center," he said, half joking. "Why not?" the customer replied seriously. 5 years ago, I was just another guy who liked to box. Now I'm helping people change their lives." He paused, then added with a smile, though usually not quite as dramatically as we met. Their story had sparked conversations across social media about workplace stress, mental health, and the power of second chances. Local news had picked up the story, focusing not on the fight but on what happened afterward. How one moment of violence had transformed into an unexpected mentorship. The worker's former co-workers at KFC had been supportive of his change. The older kitchen lady who had spoken up for him that night still called to check on him regularly. Even the assistant manager had written him a surprisingly positive reference letter for his new job, acknowledging that the incident had revealed deeper problems with their staffing and scheduling practices. "You know what's funny?" the worker said, cutting into his pancakes. "That missing biscuit, it was probably the best thing that ever happened to me. Not that I'd recommend that way of making life changes to anyone else." They'd both chuckled, able to find humor in it now that time had passed. The customer's gym had seen an uptick in membership since the story went viral, with people impressed by his handling of the situation. He'd used the attention to start a program offering free boxing classes to stressed-out service workers, teaching them healthy ways to handle frustration and conflict. As they finished their breakfast, the worker pulled out his phone to show the customer something. It was a comment on the viral video from someone claiming to be a fast food worker in another state. This story gave me hope. Been feeling the same way lately. Starting counseling next week. You see that? The customer said, pointing to the phone. Sometimes our worst moments can lead to helping others. He pulled out his wallet to pay for breakfast, but the worker stopped him. My turn this time, he insisted. I'm not that broke kid from the drive-thru anymore. They stood up to leave, each heading to their respective jobs, the customer to his gym, the worker to start another day of learning the fitness business from the ground up. The waitress watched them go, smiling to herself. She'd seen the viral video like everyone else, but these weekly breakfast meetings told the real story, one of redemption, growth, and the unexpected ways that people can change each other's lives. As they reached their cars, the customer turned to the worker. Remember, you're spotting for my advanced class tonight. The worker nodded, no longer seeing his former opponent, but rather a mentor and friend. The morning sun caught the gym's logo on his new work shirt, a physical reminder of how far he'd come from that night in the KFC parking lot. The viral video would eventually fade from social media's collective memory, replaced by newer moments of conflict and drama. But in this small town, two men had learned that sometimes the worst moment of your life can lead to the best changes, if you're lucky enough to meet the right person at the wrong time. They stood up to leave, each heading to their respective jobs, the customer to his gym, the worker to start another day of learning the fitness business from the ground up. The waitress watched them go, smiling to herself. She'd seen the viral video like everyone else, but these weekly breakfast meetings told the real story, one of redemption, growth, and the unexpected ways that people can change each other's lives. As they reached their cars, the customer turned to the worker. Remember, you're spotting for my advanced class tonight. The worker nodded, no longer seeing his former opponent, but rather a mentor and friend. The morning sun caught the gym's logo on his new work shirt, a physical reminder of how far he'd come from that night in the KFC parking lot. The viral video would eventually fade from social media's collective memory, replaced by newer moments of conflict and drama. But in this small town, two men had learned that sometimes the worst moment of your life can lead to the best changes, if you're lucky enough to meet the right person at the wrong time.